1990, and has since conducted hundreds of sessions for many of the Fortune 500 groups, many small and mid-sized businesses across the country. Mark's worked extensively with a variety of companies, which most of being part of our ag industry. Mark is an adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati and Ohio University. He's an advisor on many company boards and a professional member of the National Speakers Association. Mark's book, Growth or Bust, Proven Turnaround Strategies to Grow Your Business, has twice been on the best-selling list of the Barnes & Noble stores across the state of Ohio. A personal story about Mark, or I should say Dr. Faust. Twice in 5 deliveries, his doctor and midwife were late. He and his wife alone delivered 2 of their 5 children. Please welcome to the family farm stage, Mr. Mark Faust.
Thanks, Jim. All right, ladies, let's get real. I mean, that's no big deal, pulling the baby out. It's pushing, right? Yeah. My wife's in the room, so I got to be upfront about that. Lots of speakers here the last few days, right? Sometimes you can almost get speakered out. Somebody came up to me and said, this better be good. Makes me feel like Elizabeth Taylor's 8th husband. I know what's expected of me. I just better be sure to make it real interesting, right? Okay, the goal today in 45 minutes is to grow everyone's business here with some ideas. So our title is 3 Strategies for Growth. Proven turnaround strategies to grow your business. Subtitle of my book, Growth or Bust. And we're going to talk about strategy and some aspects of it that are missing in most every business, even Fortune 500 companies. I've worked with a few Fortune 500 CEOs, and even in their planning, they have missing elements of objectives. Even in many of the largest, best-run companies, they could still raise the bar on how effectively they innovate their business. And innovation applies to every one of us here in this room, and that's the second area we'll talk about is how can we bring profitable innovation to our businesses back home? And then thirdly, how to build a transformative culture so that we get and keep the best people and we can attract talent as it gets harder and harder to find good people, which is a challenge we heard all about over the last few days over and over again. So I want to open up with a little story and ask you a question. What is your legacy? What is your legacy going to be? Years down the road, even after you pass, people will remember your name and what you did and how you impacted people. I was down in Pocahontas, Arkansas, my mom's hometown, 4 years ago. And I was getting my last fill up at the gas station. And a guy says, hey, you're a stranger from around, you're not from around here. What are you doing in Pocahontas? And I said, well, my uncle had passed and we were just cleaning up the estate with my mom. And, well, who was that? And I said, Robert Promberger. And he said, Promberger, is that like George Promberger? And I said, yeah, that was my grandfather. He goes, let me tell you a story about George Promberger. He's the kind of guy that if 2 kids were walking down the street and one of them had a raggedy pair of shoes, he'd give one of the kids $5 and say, go across the street and buy a couple of pair of shoes for each of yourselves and help that company out over there that's not selling too many shoes right now during the Depression. He died back in 1941 and they're still telling stories about him. So I've never grown up on a farm, and neither did he. He had an ag retailer business, Pocahontas Hardware. John Deere dealership, first to sell hybrid corn in Arkansas. And the favorite stories of mine, my mom would tell me, the last meal I had with her, she reminded me about after the war, farmers would come to the house and hand a check to her mom and say, here's the money I owe you. And it happened time and time again. And she'd go to the books and she'd look at the books and it said, debt is paid. Debt is paid. He would write off their debts during the Depression. Guys, it's not going to be a George Promberger to catch you. You are the George Prombergers. You have to think now, what is your legacy going to be? And look forward decades into the future. And right now, I know also, besides the CEOs of all these businesses here, we have a lot of chairmen of the boards. Or should I say chairwomen, the wives. You're a team. And I want to ask both of you to do a little strategic thinking. Strategy is different than tactics. Strategy is what, and tactics is how. Strategy is about the direction and nature of your business. And strategic thinking, it's not strategic planning, that's an oxymoron. Strategic thinking should lead to enhancing of your focus, your approach, and most critically in a strategy, divergence. How are you going to be different than the rest of the marketplace so that you have competitive advantage? But all that begins with visioneering. And I want you to think about your first day that every one of you walked into this business. You might have been a young child helping out. You might have been coming out of college. You might have been getting back from that job that you had, whatever it was. Or you might have just got married, and here you are in this business. That was your first day. But what's your last day going to look like? And what's your business going to look like then? And how often have you spent thinking about your last day and the days after that? I want to ask you just 3 years out, right now, if all the stars aligned, and if everything went as well as you possibly can imagine for your business, what would it look like 3 years out if you were sitting here in this room in January of 3 years out, and everything went as well as it possibly can? The best businesses in the Fortune 500, the fastest growing Inc. 500 businesses, they excel during the downtimes. Downtimes are an accelerant to innovation. Right now is your opportunity. So what does it look like if all the stars align? I had the pleasure of having Mark Woldrick and Andy Schulting walk up to me yesterday with my wife there. And they said, "Mark, it's so good to run into you again." It was about 12 years ago at that BASF speech that you gave, half day, few hours of talk, that we first met. I said, "That's great. What's happened since?" He said, "Well, Andy and I got together at a Pizza Hut, and we took your visioneering exercise and your 7 essential areas of objectives worksheets, and we got to work." I said, "Well, what's been the result?" "Well, we've created 2 different businesses. We've created 36 jobs. Next week, we'll have hundreds and hundreds of people together at a very large conference, all a result of that work." So after this program, guys, FFG is going to send out to you these worksheets I'm going to allude to. You don't need to worry about taking all these notes. But the first step of all this has to do with visioneering. The greatest constraint to any business's growth is the leader's thought. And when you think about how far you've come since you've joined FFG and how they were an accelerant, I got to tell you another story here. I've been able to interview about 24 members here. And I've heard over and over again, people say to me, incrementally, because of FFG's advice and tools and things I've been able to implement. Yes, I guess you're right, Mark. I probably would say 7 figures, incremental profit, without a doubt, has come to my bottom line or is in the process of coming to my bottom line. My exhortation to you is this: you've got to get more engaged with FFG. I don't think even the top third of you have as fully, and some of you confess that upright, as much as you can. There are so few associations out there that are as uniquely set up as FFG. I've worked with 6 dozen or so associations in 24 years of running my business. And there's only a handful that run as uniquely as you do, with the non-competing environment and so forth, where you can be so open and where they have so many people working on so many different facets of running your business. And the people who've grown the most are the ones who've engaged the most. So just my 2 cents on that, but back to your vision. I'll have to tell you a few other stories here about the importance of visioneering and not selling yourself short. Myron Stein and I had the opportunity to do some work about a decade ago. And he said, Mark, I've listened to your advice, I've read your stuff, and I've set a really big stretch goal. And it starts with a stretch year where we're going to grow by 20% in 1 year. And he goes on, and I say, you know what, Myron, maybe you shouldn't tell anybody that yet. Why don't you do this? Why don't you ask each of your salespeople to write down how much they think they could grow their business over the next 3 years, and over the next year, and even over the next 90 days. So they did that. He collected them, and he was shocked. The average was in the high 30s. And 12 months later, Myron and I talked right as I'm writing my book. That's why the story's in it. And he says, Mark, we grew over 30%. Had I told them what I thought our best could have been, we would have lost out on millions. And so again, I tell you, imagine all the stars aligning. Imagine innovations you don't even... Key to strategy success is that you don't get into the tactics while you're thinking strategically. You don't think about how you're going to do it. You think about what you hope and imagine is the potential. That's who the greatest innovators are. That's who the greatest strategists are. You will develop the ways that will enable you to be more divergent. You will enhance your focus. So let's shift to tactics here for a little bit. So in the process of strategy and implementation, as it should be more aptly called, you then shift to the 7 essential areas of objectives. And most all companies are missing several areas of objectives. Before I go into companies, this is the other epiphany that hits me that many of you realize, but some still don't see, and there needs to be a nuance in how you plan. You don't run just one business. There's hardly anybody in here that runs just one business. You have multiple business units. As such, each one needs a unique strategy. We were working with an ag retailer in eastern Iowa, and when that epiphany hit them, that they had these 7 units and they had a driving force for the overall mothership and a unique driving force in each one, it changed the way they ran a variety of those companies. There's been a couple of seed companies, of 24 seed companies I've worked with, where it's dramatically increased their profitability to do this. In one case, the CEO thought, the third generation CEO thought, hey, we're a product-focused company. Maybe we're technology-focused, but we're in the seed business, and we develop these localized, focused nuances to our genetics that enable greater products. So it's either the technology or the products. But we played with the idea that maybe they're not in the product business, they're in a market-focused business. And I'll send you an article, it's in Ag Professional Magazine this month, about the driving force concept I'm alluding to here. So you can study this later. But the point was when he had the epiphany that he could sell other products and not just focus on seed, that he could sell crop insurance and add these other lines, not only did they get their foot on the farm and relationships they never otherwise would have gotten, not only did they increase their profitability with existing best customers, but ultimately, in less than 14 months, they doubled their profitability with only a 25% increase in sales. So that's what strategic thinking can lead to, when you innovate even how you approach the market. So that'll lead to these 7 essential areas of objectives. And they spell out a nice little acronym, micro-SP. There's first the marketing objectives. What are our ideal products? What are our ideal customers? At Crop Production Services in Michigan, we were able to, they were already #1 in the entire CPS areas of regions and so forth, but they were able to dramatically increase profitability by getting rid of the dogs, is what we called it. I wrote an article called Get Rid of the Dogs, and it had to do with get rid of the bottom 10% products, services, maybe even people, but especially customers. How many of you have customers that are kind of a pain in the rear? How many of you have some employees that are kind of a pain in the rear? Apropos, I got to tell you a story about one of you shared with me. One of these employees calls in and says, buddy, I'm not going to be able to make it in today. And he says, well, what's wrong? And he says, well, I got anal glaucoma. Anal glaucoma? What in the world is anal glaucoma? Well, I just don't see my rear end coming into work this day. So you've got market and marketing objectives, the most important of the 7. Who and what should you really be focused on? Secondly, how many of you have the second most important area of essential objectives in each of your different business units? Innovation objectives. Innovation objectives. How are you going to innovate and improve and create a new dimension of performance? Not just solve a problem, but create a new dimension of performance. And it's fascinating because every time you start measuring something, any of these objectives, you accelerate your performance in it. Again, a beauty of the tool set that FFG provides is what I heard over and over. Boy, when I started to measure things, it's like if you don't get close to your accounting, if you don't get a good handle on accounting, we went bowling the other night, right? That would be like bowling behind a curtain. Would it be as much fun? Would you be as successful? Absolutely not. You need to be close to your books. You can't delegate that out. Every one of you has got to have a new intimacy with your books. That'll lead to the resource objectives. But before resource and after innovation objectives are cultural objectives. So all of you have a culture already, de facto. But what are your objectives behind where you think it could be in 90 days, 360 days? Where is its potential? We'll come back and wrap up on that here. So after cultural objectives come resource objectives. You have financial, physical, and human resources. And that is, again, the beauty of FFG is they're advising you on what the proven best practices of both people in this group and of the other hundreds of experiences they have in the industry of how to take all you can out of all you got and get the highest return, which sometimes means you own your equipment, sometimes that means you lease your equipment, sometimes that means cash rent, other times it means purchase, and right now in a downtime, it means significant changes in how you're managing your resources. So in each of your businesses, there has got to be specific physical, human, and financial resource objectives to accelerate growth. After that comes productivity objectives. Productivity in your people, your things, what's their potential? And again, I suggest taking the Socratic approach like Myron Stein did and asking them. There was another third-generation seedsman I asked the vision question of, Dave Hughes, up in Woodstock, Illinois. And I said, Dave, I know you've told me that for 3 generations you've grown from about 10 to 12% a year, and maybe you could have too much growth. And I really pressed that. I said, could you really have too much growth? I mean, would you not be able to supply the product if you sold a whole bunch more? And he's like, you know what, we could. We absolutely could. And I said, so what's the real stretch objective? And are you going to let these guys set some high goals and not make it their new quota? And he and his brothers and the sales manager promised they'd do that. And they sold, instead of 10% more, they sold 36% more. Of course, there was some intense competition. Very intense competition, where even his suppliers lowered their prices below what he could even buy it for. And so he lost a lot of that 36% growth. A year later, he came up to me at one of these conferences and he said, Mark, had we not set those stretch objectives, we would have been out of business. That saved our business. To not grow all you can puts you at risk. And I know there's a fear factor we all have. I have it. Every one of the CEOs I've ever worked with sometimes thinks you can go too far. And growth is a relative term. It doesn't have to be top line growth. It doesn't have to be bottom line growth. It doesn't have to be acres. It can be a variety of things, but you've got to press the envelope to where the optimal level of growth is and get all you can out of the productivity of all you've got. And then next, after productivity, comes social responsibility objectives. That's right, objectives. Because you can get a synergy out of how you're sowing back into your community, how you're sowing back into your industry, how you're sowing back into your church or your other favorite nonprofits. And there's nothing wrong with getting back a little value for that. But pick it with some wisdom. And that's another great thing to get some chiming in from your chairman of the board on. The least important of the 7 essential areas is profitability. But it's essential, obviously. And instead of profitability, I suggest you rephrase, rename, and tell your employees about this. Profitability is reinvestment capital. Profitability requirement objectives have to do with what, not the maximum profits are that we can make, but what's the minimum we need to reach our optimal growth, which sometimes is a lot more than what you think the maximum is. And you may have to readjust. So once you've got all 7 areas of objectives in, then the fun begins. You're going to work with your team at home, your employees, your family, but you also have a team here that is not being tapped in on enough. I had the privilege to be with the GM group last December. Fabulous group. I know some of you are itching to get into something like that, but I think every single one of you has to get involved with an echelon group of some sort. Let me tell you a couple stories about this. We all know about Ben Franklin's Junto group, and he associated much of his success politically, economically, and even personally in regards to his own character development to those men he would meet with every Friday night, and how they promised to never attack each other, but they had spirited debate in a Socratic fashion based on questions. They opened up about their biggest weaknesses, concerns, and challenges, and they iron sharpeneth iron, as Proverbs says. Another great story, I'm sure many of you know about Luther Burbank. Anybody know Luther Burbank? There we go, at least one. Luther Burbank is one of the greatest agricultural minds ever. He was the pioneer of agricultural science in today. And he tells a story, it's almost 100 years old, about a farmer driving an old Model T down the road, and he comes upon this Lincoln touring car with 5 guys in it. And it's stuck in the mud. So the farmer pulls over, and he helps these guys get out. And the driver gets out and goes to shake his hand and thanks him profusely. And he says, by the way, I built that car you're driving. And this guy, he built those tires you're on. And that guy over there, well, he invented the light bulb, and the guy over there, that's the President of the United States. And then the 5th guy goes, well, sir, don't you want to know who I am? And the guy goes, well, yeah, I guess you can tell me, but if you're like the other guys, I guess you're going to tell me you're Santa Claus. The fact was, that was Luther Burbank, and he was there with Firestone and Ford and Harding and Edison. And they had what was called the Vagabond Group. And these guys would go on tours of the country, back before planes, and camp out together. And there were presidents in that group and the most successful people you can imagine in that group. And just like Carnegie told Napoleon Hill, the key is not what's in our mind, but it's what is in our mastermind. Because it's when we open up our weaknesses about our weaknesses that we have the greatest growth. And it's through our weakness that often we find our strategic advantage. It was because of David's size he could slay Goliath. It is because of the constraints of a tight economy that we can grow and innovate the fastest. So another story from Procter & Gamble I love to tell about the fuel for innovation and the fuel for good echeloning groups is this woman that headed up a product team. She was the product manager, very high position at P&G. But she had one of these guys that worked on her team that was a bit of a pill. You know those guys that have a lot of degrees. He had a JD and an MBA and a couple engineering undergraduate degrees, and he was always telling everybody about this. And he'd say things, well, I got a degree in this area. Let me help you out here. And, I got a degree in law. Let me help you out with that. Well, he said at one time in this meeting with Mary, and he says, Mary, I got a degree in that. Let me comment on it. And Mary said right in front of everybody, Jack, even thermometers have degrees. And you know where people stick thermometers? The key is you got to stay humble. Humble fuels innovation. Humility fuels great culture. Humility, and when you lack it, the lack of humility is what causes recessions. Recession's a result of a lack of innovation. Recessions are a good response to poor business management. So let's shift into innovation. Let's talk about the simplicity and how easy it is to foster innovation in any facet of your company and in any of your business units. And this has to be simple. I can do it, and I'm not that smart. The closest I ever got to a 4.0 was my blood alcohol content. So and let me open up with a couple stories to illustrate just the simplicity of this. The first one is a classic barbershop with a little pole, spinning out there, 3 guys cutting hair. And who should come to town but home of the $9 haircut? Supercuts. It kills their business. And so before they know it, they've lost half their customers, half their revenue. 3 guys cannot make it. Maybe 1 guy could turn out being a little bit better off, but not 3. But they had heard about the innovation formula, the process of brainstorming and furious implementation, and they committed to coming in an hour early every day. They changed it to a half hour because they could do it so fast, didn't even take that, and listing out 20 ideas a day on a little yellow legal pad. One of the first ideas they implemented was they rented and eventually they bought the sign on top of their building. And all they put up there was a picture of a hand pointing down to their front door and just a few words. We fix $9 haircuts. And the buzz began. They grew their business. Supercuts didn't go out of business. There actually must have been a growth of haircuts going on because they actually grew and Supercuts was still around. Another great example of a small business innovating their way out of a potential death situation. And the point of this is you can innovate your way out of any situation. I've been in turnaround situations where 5th generation companies were ready to shut the door. And it was when they committed to a turnaround mindset. And this is the theme of my book, brilliantly inspired in part by the publisher, that even the most successful companies, when they have a turnaround mindset, accelerate their growth and accelerate their innovation. So imagine a mom and pop pizza place, 3 locations, doing great, 30 years of business in a mid-sized American town in Ohio. And who should come to town in the late 80s but that Leviathan of Domino's? The full-page ads, the yellow page, full-page, yellow page ads, the mailers and all that kind of stuff, the magnets and everything. They innovated every aspect of marketing and advertising the pizza business. Hot, fresh pizza in 30 minutes or less, or it's free. They were accurate, weren't they? And never said it tasted good, just hot and fresh and fast, right? So this place loses over half of their business. They're going to have to close a couple of shops. Maybe even that one won't succeed because they're all buttressed by these Domino's delivery spots. But they implement the innovation formula. They hold a daily meeting from 2 to 3 at the 2:30 to 3:30 at the down hour, have both shifts there, and they brainstorm a list on a flip chart of 20 ideas that might get or keep more customers or increase profitability. And one of the first ideas they implemented was from a 16-year-old delivery driver. And when the dad was writing it down, and the mom thought the same thing, they were thinking, oh my God, there's no way, that's going to be expensive, because it was, hey, let's give away a large pizza to anybody that brings in that full-page, yellow page ad from Domino's. And they thought, boy, that'd be expensive. But they got home, they thought about it, and they implemented it. And after about a month, you couldn't find a full yellow page ad at even the phone booths. It worked. It grew their business. In fact, it took Domino's 2 years to figure out that's what they had to do. And they had 3 full-page ads then. And they literally had to have Tom Monahan fly in there to save their own businesses. So you can innovate your way out of any situation. The president of John Deere's construction division, Nortrax, Tim Murphy, called me up. I'd wanted to get a quote from him for the back of the book, and he said, oh, sure. So I sent him an advanced copy and all this. And then I could never get a hold of him. 4 months went by, I could never get a hold of him. And we're going to press and all this, and he can't return my calls for the first time ever. He always would return my calls. So in any event, we get this extension, and we literally had an hour to get something on the cover if we were going to put anybody else. And I get a hold of him. He sends me an email and gives me this fabulous quote, and I called him back to thank him, and I had to ask that question. Boy, that was a great quote, but I gotta ask you, did you actually read it? And he goes, oh, Mark, I made copies. I don't know if that's legal or not, but I copied it out for the entire management team. We went through it on a week-to-week basis for 8 weeks, and we did the innovation thing. And, well, my gosh, without a doubt, added a ton of new jobs. And I said, well, ballpark, I mean, what are you talking? Well, you could probably say over the course of time, it'll be at least 100 jobs, tens of millions of dollars to profitability. I said, my God, that's the quote I want. I called him back. It was too late. But the bottom line, you implement innovation as a process. And maybe it's just you, because some of our employees aren't going to be that involved or that committed to that type of thing. But you've got to commit to innovation objectives and a process of continuous improvement in each of your businesses, and especially defined strategic advantage, not just cost improvements. But how can you get and keep more customers? Identify the ideal markets where there's more of the blue ocean, fewer customers, fewer competitors going after a handful of customers type thing, and go to the deep blue oceans. But basically, it's as simple as identifying what are your top constraints in the business, number one. Listing those out. Prioritize those. Which ones most impact our company? And here's a key principle that ties back to Drucker, the founder of business management theory and the guy who coined the word strategy within the context of business. In fact, his publisher wouldn't let him use the word strategy in the title. He wanted to call a book the Strategy of Business. And they said, that's a military term. Nobody will get it. So he came up with a different word, self-assessment, which he said was actually more apt. And it's what he used for most of his discussions about how to improve a company, because in self-assessment, it implies more obviously that it's a quarterly, ongoing process, not a once-a-year retreat. It implies that there's always the examination for where can we improve and innovate the business. It also requires the interviewing of our customers to find out not how are we doing and survey them, but rather what are their biggest challenges and what's next? Where can we improve service, but where can we innovate? And so identify your top challenges and constraints in a business and prioritize them. And another great book, The Goal, talks about the theory of constraints. One of the ways to accelerate the growth of your business is to constantly be looking for the constraint in every one of its processes. What is the greatest constraining factor? And then innovate around that, and then move on to the next one. Prioritize those constraints and innovate and implement furiously and move on to the next one. The innovation process can be just you or a group of people. It should ideally involve customers, vendors, et cetera. It's amazing, but what about the folks in this room? In fact, I recommend that as you guys build more and more of these echeloning groups, that you follow the outline of the good, the bad, and the new. And the good is, what's a success that you've had that others could benefit from? What's a challenge you want ideas on? And what's an innovation yet to be implemented, but you're going to share and discuss? And in those environments, brainstorm ideas, prioritize those ideas, and then implement. It's that simple. Now, finally, culture. What about our culture? What is the state of your culture? And is it on purpose or not? Drucker was apt to say that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. The three legs of the stool of any organization is strategy, operations, and culture. But culture can make up for a lot of problems. Now, one of the things that establishes and grows a culture is defining what are your values. How do you want to be treated? How do you want your team to treat each other? And how do you want them to treat your customers? Is really what the answer to that question is creates the answer to what your values should be. But it's the beliefs and behaviors that govern behaviors, the definition of culture. If you don't identify and prioritize what the most important values are that would improve the way in which people communicate and improve the way in which they would treat each other, would improve the way in which they feel about their work, you're leaving a load of opportunity on the table. The fact is that the best run companies, the most profitable companies, and this has been studied, Ken Blanchard has led some of the most notable ones, that values-driven companies, purpose-driven companies are the ones that are the most profitable and tend to innovate more and are even the best to invest in. But they are the companies that identify, promote, and hire and fire based on values. When was the last time you gave somebody a review in regards to their living out the values of the workplace? It doesn't have to be complicated, and you can get plenty of inspiration online, whether it's Zappos is hailed as one of the best places to work. I'll tell the story of what happened at one manufacturer in Iowa I'm on the board of. They had a tough time recruiting people to this town of 3,000 and constantly in need of welders and so forth and painters. And it was very hard to get people. Well, they went from that situation to now they're the number 6 best place to work in Iowa. They have resumes coming in regularly from their competition, John Deere and Case and so forth. It's Hagee. And their culture is their competitive advantage, and it's defensible, and nobody can steal it. The people are driven, and they innovate, and constantly are looking for ways to improve the way they do their work and go through walls for people. This one grower never let anybody spray his crops. And I don't know how many thousands of acres he had up in Minnesota, but it was a bit of a chore, and late season spraying, you got to get it in at a certain time, and V8, V12, he didn't have much time. And he somehow, one of the guys back at the office found this out, and that he has cancer and was sick and in the hospital, and he wasn't going to be able to spray. And so they got on up there without asking anybody, getting permission, and did it. And the guy just wept when he got visited in the hospital and was told that everything was taken care of, because that was his pride and joy. But that employee was able to do that because he knows the values of the company. He's empowered and can make decisions and doesn't have to be told all the time what to do. And he knows the customer's priority. So the simplicity of identifying and rolling out your values can look like this. Remember at one seed company we were working with in Indiana, we just had a lunch. And there was a few dozen people there, and we got together with them during lunch, and they're eating away, and I give them some examples of world-class value statements from Procter & Gamble, IBM, other ag companies, John Deere, and Zappos, and I said, but guys, you come up with a list of 6 on these index cards. What are the 6 values you would want for this workplace to be an engaging, happy place to be? And prioritize them, and let's turn those in. And it's just the answer to how do you want to be treated, and how do you hope that we treat the customers here at work? And they did that, and we collected them, and we read them out loud, and we kind of compiled this list, and we had about 20 some odd values up there, put it up on the PowerPoint, and I ripped them all up, throw them in the garbage, and I said, now guys, make another list. After you read that, what inspires you to be the top 6? They did it again, and I said, okay, now get together in groups of 2 and negotiate your top 6. Get together in groups of 4, negotiate your top 6. Groups of 8, and before you know it, we're done. And I've done this hundreds of times, and it's amazing. At one ag retailer, it was so big, 100 and some odd employees, we had to have 3 different groups do this, and they came up with nearly exactly the same list, those 3 different groups that weren't even together. And yet, that list is very different from the company I do it the next day with, which is very similar to theirs. You already have a culture. They're already striving for something. But the real challenge comes to answering this question. How will we deal with it when somebody doesn't live up to these values? And even more importantly, how will you deal with it how will you be dealt with if you don't live up to those values in the eyes of your employees? Is there a line of authority that even keeps you in check? Well, that's one reason we have our chairman of the board next to us, right? And is that explained to the team that you and her are a team and that there is an accountability for everyone? The greatest transformations and growth just leaps I've seen have happened with a handful of things like innovation, a handful of strategic thinking outputs, and cultural transformations that led back to that CEO, owner, or ownership team holding themselves accountable, frequently to a newly formed board or to groups like this, like you have, and being accountable not just for the numbers, but for how they act, how they treat each other, and raising the bar in all areas of the company. So with that, I want to ask you now, where can you innovate most in your company? Where do you need to do some additional planning? And do you need to block some time to have some strategic thinking? Because it's all about implementation. It's all fruitless unless you go back and change something to grow your business. So as you think out to that third year, 3 years from now, and if you're looking back and all the stars have aligned, what is the most optimistic you can imagine? And are you ready to raise the bar on what your current vision is and stretch it? Are you ready to engage on those around you and ask them what they think the potential is? Are you ready to have a dialogue about how you can have continuous improvement in every facet of the company? Are you ready to engage and commit with FFG and implement best practices like you never have before? Is there anything you're afraid of? I want to wrap up with a little story about, has to do with making that promise to yourself and your team. And there are two stories here. One has to do with my mom. When I was 2 years old, she noticed something was a little different about the way my eyes worked. And she'd put her arm in front of one eye and I'd move it. She'd put her arm in front of the other eye, I wouldn't do anything. And she took me to this doctor, and highly respected man and father of one of our neighbors. She even went to him a second time and said, I know there's something wrong. She persisted. She persisted to find out what was wrong. And he laughed in her face the last time she saw him and said, oh, you're just a worrywart mom. Get out of here. He's fine. And she walked right from his office to the phone booth, looked up ophthalmologist, called somebody. Guy said, you know, I'm going to make room for you this evening. You come over right now. And we saw him at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He looked at me, walked out for 10 minutes, came back, seemed like an eternity. He told my mom, he said, you know what? We're going to get a second opinion tonight. I've already set up an appointment with another ophthalmologist. I'm just in my mid-20s. I've only been doing this a few years. I've never seen a retinoblastoma, but your son seems to have it. And that's a cancer that if it hits the brain, he's dead. And he could be days or weeks from death. I don't know. And sure enough, the next morning I was operated on. Had my mom not persisted, I would have died. Sometimes if we don't persist, our businesses can die. If we don't commit to raising the bar, we can die. Another story has to do with a man who wasn't balancing his time between the business or his calling and the family. And so he made a series of promises to his wife, his 2 girls, and his son. And he said, you guys are the number one priority in my life. Mom first, but then you kids, and then the business is second. And if you ever are in need of me, I am there for you, I promise. I will be there for you, I promise. And he made a series of promises like that, and it wasn't a few months later that he was transferred in his missionary work down to Central America. And they've moved down there, they're into their little new home, and a few weeks after settling in, during he being at work, one of the worst earthquakes hits this region in the history of Central America. He rushes home to find the house has fallen over. And he sees his 2 daughters and his wife standing out there crying. But they're not crying about the house or the being so scared about the event, and crying about the son who's at school and what they've been hearing on the radio about how serious this is in the city. So he rushes to the school, and they've already cordoned it off with the caution tape. It was basically, as he described it, a pile of rubble. And of course, the first thing that came to mind was his promise to always be there for his family. He broke through the caution tape. He went to the corner where he knew those kids were at that time of day, and he just started picking up rocks and bricks and wood and throwing it off to the side. And working and getting splinters in his hands and ripped skin. And he was approached several times by policemen and firemen saying, "Sir, you're not allowed to be here. This has already been cordoned off as a lost cause. We could use you over here." And he said, "No, I've made a promise to my son. And dead or alive, I'm going to find him." Nobody messed with him. 24 hours into it, nothing but water, calling out for his son. "Son, are you there? Son!" People would be crying as they would pass him. 36 hours, no sleep, no food, bloodied hands and splintered arms, a big pile over to the side. "Son, are you there? Son!" And he hears something, and he keeps digging. And he finally hears, "Dad, it's you. I knew you would be here because you promised. And there's 12 other kids here whose lives you saved." And he saved 13 people there because he made and kept that promise. So guys, you hold in your hands a facet of the American economy, and you are the top 1% of the top 1% of an industry that guides an industry that is critical to not just our nation, but freedom in the world even. And nothing limits you more than your own thought. So what is the promise you're going to make to grow and innovate and build a team like you've never done before? Thank you very much.